The United States just announced it's immediately cutting off all trade talks with Canada. This isn't a minor hiccup. It's a direct response to Canada's new digital services tax, a move President Trump is calling a blatant attack on American firms. Payments for this tax are due Monday, including retroactive charges, and they're set to hit leading U.S. tech companies like Amazon, Google, and Meta, with a collective bill that could reach billions of dollars. This situation is rapidly escalating into a full-blown trade dispute with significant implications for American jobs and our economic relationship with our closest neighbor. Canada's Digital Services Tax Act, which became law last year and took effect on June 28th, is a 3% levy on revenue that large technology firms earn from Canadian users. This isn't based on profit, but on gross revenue from online activities like advertising services, social media platforms, online marketplaces, and the sale or licensing of user data. A particularly contentious aspect of this new framework is its retroactive application, demanding payments on revenue earned as far back as January 1, 2022. To be affected, companies must have global revenues exceeding $820 million and Canadian revenues of more than $14.7 million. The U.S. administration and Congress have consistently viewed these types of taxes as discriminatory and unjustified. President Trump has explicitly labeled it a, quote, blatant attack on the U.S. because it disproportionately targets leading U.S. technology firms such as Amazon, Google, Meta, Uber, Airbnb, Apple, and Microsoft, while conveniently exempting Canadian domestic competitors. This, according to the U.S., severely undermines a key American export sector and our crucial bilateral trade ties. Industry estimates suggest this tax could cost U.S. firms between $900 million and $2.3 billion annually, potentially resulting in up to 3,000 U.S. job losses. The initial retroactive charges alone could total up to $3 billion, with payments due on June 30. In response to Canada's unwavering decision to proceed with the digital services tax, President Trump immediately announced the termination of all ongoing trade discussions with Canada. He stated forcefully that Canada would be informed of new tariff rates they would face within just 7 days. The U.S. Trade Representative is now expected to promptly open a Section 301 investigation to formally determine the full extent of harm these new Canadian taxes pose to the U.S. economy. President Trump has asserted that the U.S. holds, quote, all the cards economically over Canada, calling their decision to implement the tax foolish. He has consistently voiced strong frustration with Canada, previously characterizing it as, quote, a very difficult country to trade with, and has even accused them of imposing exorbitant tariffs, as high as 400% on U.S. dairy products for years. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent echoed these concerns about the retroactive nature of the tax, stating it was, quote, patently unfair, and expressed hope that the newly elected Canadian administration would, quote, put a brake on it as a gesture of goodwill during trade talks, given that the legislation originated in the prior Canadian administration. Furthermore, a bipartisan group of congressional members had already sent a letter to President Trump urging a, quote, swift government response to this, quote, unprecedented retroactive tax, warning it would set a, quote, terrible precedent that could empower other nations to target U.S. firms with similar discriminatory cash grabs, damaging the U.S. tax base and economic competitiveness. Despite intense U.S. opposition and diplomatic pressure, Canada's finance minister had previously asserted that the country would not delay the implementation of the tax, emphasizing that it was duly voted into law by Parliament and that digital services taxes are not unique to Canada. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has indicated that Canada remains committed to continuing these complex negotiations in the best interests of Canadians, reiterating his stance that it's, quote, a negotiation. In a swift preemptive move, Canada has already retaliated against potential U.S. tariffs by imposing a quota on some U.S. steel imports and a 50% surcharge for imports exceeding that quota, explicitly citing the need to protect its domestic industry from what it deems unjust U.S. tariffs. This current tension follows previous rounds of significant impact on Canada from Trump's prior trade actions, including a 50% tax on steel and aluminum imports and 25% duties on foreign-made vehicles and auto parts. Historically, Canada has responded in kind, previously levying 25% tariffs on approximately $43 billion worth of U.S. goods, including whiskey, sporting gear, and household appliances, in response to earlier U.S. tariffs. Prominent Canadian business leaders, including the Business Council of Canada and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, have consistently warned that implementing a unilateral digital services tax risked undermining the the crucial economic relationship with the United States and have openly urged Canada to propose eliminating the DST in exchange for the elimination of U.S. tariffs. This situation in North America is not isolated. Several other countries across the globe, including France, the UK, Spain, Italy, Austria, Turkey, India, Kenya, and Indonesia, have already introduced similar digital services taxes. The U.S. government has consistently opposed these measures as well, with many of these international disputes having been temporarily paused pending global agreement talks led by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Canada, after initially waiting until 2024 for these international negotiations to make progress, ultimately decided to move ahead with its digital services tax when those broader talks stalled. President Trump has drawn direct parallels, noting that the European Union has implemented the same thing and is currently under discussion with the U.S., implying that European nations could face similar economic retaliation if they proceed with their own digital taxes, especially as the July 9th deadline looms for Trump's reciprocal tariffs to resume unless new trade deals are inked. Canada is consistently one of the top two trading partners for the United States, signifying a deeply intertwined economic relationship characterized by a long history of supply chain integration, particularly in the automotive, textiles, and energy sectors. Total goods trade between the two nations was estimated at $762.1 billion in 2024. U.S. goods exports to Canada totaled $349.4 billion in 2024, firmly establishing Canada as the top destination for U.S. exports. Meanwhile, U.S. goods imports from Canada were $412.7 billion in the same year, making Canada the third largest source of U.S. imports and contributing to a U.S. goods trade deficit of $63.3 billion. Key U.S. exports to Canada include vehicles, machinery, energy products, and over $30 billion in agricultural products, such as bakery goods, cereals, pasta, and fresh vegetables. Conversely, Canada's leading exports to the U.S. are energy products and vehicles, and over $40 billion in agricultural products. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which replaced NAFTA in 2020, currently undergirds nearly $2 trillion of U.S. goods and services trade within the region, with comprehensive rules subject to dispute settlement. While most Canadian goods are typically exempt from previous 25% tariffs if they comply with USMCA terms, significant exceptions remain, particularly steel and aluminum. This latest trade threat briefly caused U.S. stock markets, including the S&P 500 and NASDAQ, to dip into the red on Friday, reflecting immediate investor anxiety, though they later rallied to close at all-time highs. This ongoing dispute underscores the complex and often unpredictable nature of international trade relations, especially concerning the evolving challenge of taxation in the digital economy. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more financial insights, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next update.